Thank you all for coming out this morning. This is an incredibly important topic for the federal workforce right now. I'd like to start by asking our panelists to tell us what they mean by reskilling. Ever since I've been covering federal government issues, which is approximately forever, there's always been a talk about training, the need for retraining, more training. What's different with reskilling? What do we actually mean by that? So,
I think from our perspective, when we talk about reskilling and we talk about upskilling, reskilling is really taking a look at how do we prepare individuals for a different job than the job that they have today. And you can do that in one of two ways, by relying on the skill sets that they have and retraining them for different occupations, or bringing in individuals from totally different occupations and reskilling them, retraining them for a different job. I think the difference with that and upskilling is you take that individual who's in a specific occupation and you enhance that skill set so they are better in the job that they have. So when we talk about reskilling and upskilling, it really is how do we get you trained for a different job for reskilling, and then how do we make you do your job better from an upskilling position.
So to focus on that a little bit more, I do think it also has to do with a workforce planning and succession planning bent, because we need an agile workforce. So just like Vicki said, it's not about making you be able to do your job better, more efficiently, more complex tasks. It's actually saying what are some transferable skills that you may have that will allow us to put you in a different position than you currently encumber for the best optimal use of the organization, and also you're still stacking onto your own professional skill set. Just also one other piece, it's also about reframing what we think about training, because it may not mean all classroom-based formal training. It could involve mentoring. It could involve giving people more complex or different tasks to allow them to rise to the challenge, but ultimately getting the work done of the agency as it is today, not how it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
I'd like to add to that and say that I think there's a part of reskilling that's also very important, which is the cultural component of reskilling. When I think about reskilling, I think about opportunities, and opportunities that I might not have considered because maybe they weren't in our traditional career path. But if we look at things a little bit differently, like slot players, and you say your skills are transferable over here, now you're increasing access to opportunity and mobility of a workforce. So training is an essential component to all of it, right? The cultural part is where you're doing continuous learning so that you can reskill and redeploy to other functional areas that you might not have considered in the past.
So because you're all from very different agencies, I'd like you to maybe touch a little bit on what you're seeing within your own agencies, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening more broadly in government. But Vicki, do you want to start us off with DoD?
Well, excuse me. When we think about reskilling, I think one of the most important things that we're doing in the Department of Defense is we've just instituted a cyber accepted service, so a new cyber workforce. And so that workforce is pulling from individuals who are IT related or even intelligence. And so we are reskilling them, so now they move into a cyber accepted service workforce. But when we talk about upskilling, what we want to do for, let's say for our HR practitioners, which I know a lot of you out there are, is how do we make data analysts out of our HR practitioners? We don't want to move you out of your jobs as HR practitioners, but we want you to understand what big data is, what's HR data. When you look at it, what does it mean? How do you slice and dice it? How do you use that from a strategic workforce perspective to determine where the gaps are, where the skill gaps are for the different occupational functionals? So that's two examples of upskilling and then also for reskilling from the DoD.
From a Peace Corps perspective, this is an incredibly unique organization and position. First off, every position in the Peace Corps is accepted service, and we're limited to 60-month appointments with the opportunity to possibly have a one-time renewal at the discretion of the director. But that means I'm constantly on the staff that we bring in to develop their skills and make them able to develop a skill set that'll carry them into their next federal job. Because what also comes with being a Peace Corps employee is after 3 years of service, you become non-competitively eligible to accept an appointment in the civil service. So we already have that climate at Peace Corps. What we're trying to do is also broaden the horizon, since about 57% of our team come from the returned Peace Corps volunteer sector. They're highly motivated, they're highly educated, but it's explaining to them, if you would love a job in federal service, we want you. You may not be on the track to enter the foreign service or to work in an international aid capacity, but guess what? If I can teach you budget or get you into cybersecurity or into HR or into management operations, you're going to have a great career path in any civil service agency. So we do invest a lot in getting people excited about that. Where we fall short, and I think a lot of you may have this feel this common pain, is with funding. Because while we want to be unique and give a lot of non-paid for training opportunities, we still need to keep an emphasis on training and development, because while they're with us, we want to continually emphasize the fact that you have to always be in learning mode to keep up with what the government is doing.
I love this conversation. So there's so much I can say about this, but I think it's important first to let the audience know that I enter this conversation about workforce reskilling from a technologist management lens, right? And so I've been fortunate to have my colleagues on the HR and the learning side be very patient with me when I talk about workforce reskilling and my passion around it. But let me tell you about what we're doing at NSF. A little over a year ago, the Chief Information Officer at NSF and I sat down together and we were talking about how to bring artificial intelligence into NSF's merit review process to carry out the mission. And the first thing we asked ourselves was about how we would need to prepare the IT workforce to work alongside and with new technologies that they've never used before, right? And then we jumped to the next one. Well, what do we need to do for the workforce that's going to be working with this IT that might take a portion of their job away? And then we said, well, how can we use these same advanced technologies so that we can enable a culture of continuous reskilling and redeploying within our agency? And so when you play something like that all the way forward and then back up, you can be thoughtful and deliberate about the impacts on people. If you know where you're going to insert technology and you know the roles affected, then you can give them an opportunity to reskill and redeploy. So what we learned at NSF was that we really upskilled people. We moved them from low value to high value work for the pilots that we've done so far. And we haven't had a lot of opportunity to reskill, but we've taken our passion and interest around bringing advanced technologies to bear for our critical resource, the workforce, and we've started working cross-agencies and on cross-agency priority goals like the workforce for the 21st century, and with the CIO Council and their initiative on cyber reskilling, and are really just getting out there trying to see how we can make this happen for the federal government.
So one of the things that has intrigued me about this administration's approach is they have been very explicit about wanting to put federal employees into new jobs for which they are not currently qualified or don't currently have the skills. And it's really going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And one of the very recent developments was a new pilot program to bring in non-technical personnel to train to become qualified for cyber analyst positions. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know you are familiar with that.
Absolutely. I'm excited about that. And to the extent that we can take people in functions that are not what we're looking to fill and give them opportunities, I'm all for it. So with respect to the cyber reskilling program, Dorothy Aronson, the NSF Chief Information Officer, sits on the executive subcommittee for the CIO Council, and the cyber reskilling program was rolled out last Friday, and it asks for non-IT people to, if they're interested, take an assessment and see if they can go on a fast-track training course to become a cyber analyst. I think that's fantastic. And so when people say, well, why non-IT? Well, why not? Right? So when in my early career, I was a financial analyst, right? And people thought, oh, you're going to be a CFO someday. There's a career ladder there. That implies that I'm interested in being a CFO someday, right? But as a financial analyst, what I love about what I do is that I get to use analytical thinking, critical thinking skills. I can tell stories about the data that I'm seeing, and all of that might make me a good data scientist or a good cyber analyst. And so if we start looking at jobs from a work and a skills perspective instead of a career path perspective, I think we don't have a workforce shortage or a workforce gap. I think we have a gap in the creativity we use to slot people into positions that they could be good performers in.
And if I could, sorry.
No, go ahead, I'll add
I
to
was
it.
going to say there's a magic word she used that everyone needs to write down, take back to your office, and pin it, to your office door. It's assessment, because we force people into jobs where they may not have an interest, but also may not have an aptitude for. So we really need to take a look at what are those cross-functional skills that you can build on. And then the second part of that is having a trained management force. While we're focusing more on technology, and that is important, one of the biggest failures I see that government has not done a good job of is selecting who their next generation of leaders will be, because they cap out at a certain level and they assume we'll just promote you up. And a lot of these folks do not have the aptitude to be in leadership positions. And then I'm staring at my row of employment and labor specialists. You keep my folks really well employed, and I'm sure all of your employee and labor specialists at your agencies, because it just causes a host of problems. So we have to get back to basics, and assessments is where that happens.
So I'd like to add to that. I think that OPM kind of set the stage for this whole reskilling effort within the cyber workforce. Last year, we did a lot of work of laying out what are the competency, skills, and abilities required to be cyber analysts, what kind of training, education, and professional development do they need, what are the competencies, where are those gaps, and now it's incumbent upon all of our agencies to take a look at where those gaps are, and whether you're pulling from the IT, whether you're pulling from Intel, or whether you're pulling from non-cyber, non-IT related occupations, I think we have a good foundation to help reskill the workforce to move from non-traditional cyber jobs into the cyber workforce. And it's not just cyber. There are other occupations out there where we're going to see technology is going to help you do your job better. So how do we help train those individuals to maximize the use of that technology? In the Department of Defense, we have about 950,000 civilians spread across the world. It's very difficult to do that one-on-one interface with them. So what we want to do is how do we leverage artificial intelligence from a virtual coach perspective, so that, as my co-presenters here have said, it's not about the occupation that you're in, it's about your holistic self. What are your competencies, skills, and abilities that you bring, not necessarily in the job that you have, but from you as a total person? And then how do we determine what's the next way forward for you, using either career paths or career maps, or pulling all of that data together, serving it up so you can see what kind of options are out there. Another thing that we do in DoD, and we'll move on, is the Defense Competency Assessment. We talked about assessment, so assessing those occupations, what are those skills that you used to use 4 or 5 years ago that you don't use today, and what do you think you're going to need for the future, and then using that out to help determine what those trends are for the future.
Just to respond to a comment Robyn made, no one has ever told me I have a career path to become a CFO anywhere. So I like the idea that there are lots of paths out there for different skills, different people. What skills or what jobs do you feel are maybe most amenable to this kind of treatment, reskilling, setting up pilot programs to bring in new talent streams? What kinds of positions are we talking about?
I'll take a stab at that first. And so I would say that what we know about what technology can do is that it can do anything that's routine and repeatable and process driven. So I know for a fact that there are parts of my job today that I should not expect to do 5 or 10 years from now, or maybe even 2 to 3 years from now. And I'm okay with that, because they're not my favorite parts of the job, and I'd like to free myself up to do other things. And so when we look at what kinds of positions are the ones you look at for reskilling, I really think that the question is, what part of the work that each of us does might we not need to do a couple of years from now, and how do we put an eye to the future and prepare ourselves for the next thing? So again, I'm going to keep taking this back to the culture of continuous learning, because reskilling is not a one and done thing. Technology is advancing rapidly, and it will not move any more slowly than it is today, right? So we should not sit and wait for the next thing. We should get ahead of it. And to Dr. Brown's point, there is a lot of data out there. There are a lot of tools. Let's bring them together. Let's expose opportunities to people, and let's help them continuously be prepared to reskill and redeploy in whatever occupation it is they see themselves.
From a DoD perspective, we have a lot of blue-collar workers, manufacturer workers. We have shipbuilders. We have aircraft builders. We have a lot of blue-collar workers that are in a process manufacturing kind of function. A lot of that work is going to be done by technology. So then we'll have to reskill those blue-collar workers to either, one, manage that technology to the greatest extent possible, or to move on to different occupations. And so I think that because we have such a large blue-collar workforce within the Department of Defense, that's one area that's ripe for piloting for different kinds of reskilling occupations as they move away from those very manual processes that now will be supported by technology.
I think we also need to look at, we talked about transferable skills. To me, there's a common set of skills that a knowledge-based workforce should be investing in, giving assessments for, and training for. So things such as oral and written communication, critical thinking. I also call that, we might need some remedial common sense in some departments. But you really need to have folks that can think and question and know what they're doing. When they look at data, can they make sense of it? Or are they just spitting out numbers and they have no idea how it connects to one another? For human resources, there's been a real shift in the last 10 years from transactional HR to strategic HR. We still need folks to perform quality assurance to make sure that data is going into the systems is correct, and it's teaching them it's okay for them to question. Because what we did in the past is we just said, just do it, just put what's on the form in the system. And now we're taking that away from them and saying, no, now we want you to think about what you're putting in there, so it's not garbage in, garbage out. And that takes a lot of time when you have programmed folks to be purely transactional, and that's why I kind of get on the stick about having good managers and good performance management metrics, because it's going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not fair of us to assume it's going to happen overnight.
So, Traci, you bring up a really good point. It's critical that managers understand these dynamics and manage their workforce to determine where people need to be reskilled. What do you see as the challenges for managers across government? And I would ask each of you to answer that.
Sure. Well, I think first off, we need to have trained managers so they understand that is a critical part of their work. They're not just super technicians doing more of the same at a higher grade level or a higher level in general. We also need to teach them what to look for and how to go about doing it in a proactive way, not just in a punitive way. Not coming to me at the end of a performance year and saying, we want to put someone on a performance improvement plan. And my first question is going to be, what have you done to help them be successful? Why did you select them for this job? What was going on there? And making sure they understand this is a valuable resource, and we want to make sure we've exhausted our opportunities before we just toss them to the side or say that it's hopeless. I would say 90% of the issues I see is because managers don't know what to look for and what to ask, and they also don't feel supported. So it gets back to the idea of how are we creating a culture of continuous learning and empowering folks to do that and still get the work done. It's a huge culture shift for the government, and it's going to take a long time, I think, to ingrain that in everyone.
And I'd like to add to that. I think that in addition to all of the things that Traci and Robyn have said, systems thinking, I think that's something that we don't do well as leaders. How does everything fit together? We work in very discrete buckets. We do this function, we do this function, we do that function, but to what end? So learning systems thinking, how does it all fit together? And then you're able to determine where your gaps are, what skills you need to work on, who do you need to hire with what competency set in order to have a whole picture. So I think that's one of those interpersonal skills that all leaders need to have at all levels. How does that whole big picture fit together?
So I'm going to take this in just a slightly different direction. When I think about challenges that managers face when we're looking at a future of needs for reskilling, I think one of the challenges is just a process challenge where what we're used to as hiring managers is looking at resumes and looking for years of experience and certifications and degrees in a certain area of expertise. And when we talk about reskilling and redeploying, we're not talking about somebody who's come up through that years of experience and expertise. And so how do we equip managers with a tool or just with the mindset of being more open to leveraging eligible workforce candidates, leveraging those people in jobs that they might not on paper look like they're qualified for, but maybe their skills are a good fit for? In my experience, the other challenge is that when we look at how we leverage the strengths of our team, right? So we're looking at the skill sets instead of just what you've hired the person for, and we're looking at reskilling. We have to bring the people along with us, and we have to look at what they're inherently good at and slot them in places where they're good. So I haven't seen a lot of a defunct federal workforce. What I've seen is a federal workforce who maybe has a leadership mismatch, who doesn't understand their skills and how they might slot well into the team. Or I've seen where perhaps the federal workforce is in a skills mismatch, and we might imagine that they were left behind decades ago when we went from paper-based to automated systems. Right? So how do we not do that again? How do we change the way that we look at making people able to take control of their own future, choose their own path, train for it, prove efficiency and competency, and then actually hire them for the job? I want to see all of that change. That's the hard work. So it's not just supervisor or first-line managers. It's leadership that needs to start tackling those things.
So it's
Let's do
like
it.
getting the right person in the right job with the right skill set at the right time.
That sounds simple. So all of this, not all of it maybe, but much of it costs money. What kind of funding are you seeing? I mean, that's really what sometimes these things come down to. How well supported and resourced are these ideas?
Well, I think for the cyber accepted service, I think it's well funded. I think that the need is there, the importance is there, and that's one of the leading edge things that we're doing. But training, education, and professional development, whether it's reskilling or whether it's upskilling, it's still all training. It's generally not as funded as well as it should be. And the challenge we have on the Department of Defense is not only do we have 900,000 civilians, we have 1.2 million soldiers. And so our number one mission is to fight and win the nation's war. So right now we are looking at how to recapitalize funding to give back to the warfighter. And when you do that, other things tend to not necessarily be as important, but don't have the funding that they need. So funding is always going to be an issue for training, education, and professional development, whether we're reskilling individuals or whether we're upskilling individuals. But there are things that we can do that don't necessarily require funding. Right. Everybody thinks that they have to go to school, sit in class, in order to get retrained or upskilled. There are a number of other opportunities to do that by shadowing individuals, developmental assignments, broadening assignments, those kinds of things that don't require you to travel or have per diem or pay tuition. We just have to convince the workforce that these kind of non-traditional opportunities to reskill and upskill are just as important and just as valuable to you as an individual as it is sitting in class, learning skills, and then taking those back to the job. So it's just a paradigm shift, I think.
Dr. Brown was incredibly classy and succinct, and I'm going to take it a whole nother way. We don't value training in the government at all. The first thing that gets cut in the budget is training. And until we actually put our money where our mouth is, it's never going to change. We also have to get back to allowing managers to feel safe enough to let their folks shadow others, to do maybe some cross-agency, cross-department gaining of skills. The first thing a manager is going to say to me is, "Oh, great, Traci, let them get trained, and then they're going to leave me." That's okay, because then someone else will come behind them that we can train.
Or if you treated them right,
they will
come
stay.
back.
Yes, or they will come back. It's a huge cultural mindset change that we're going to have to do, and it has to start, I agree, at the top. but it also has to start with everyone sitting in this room and everyone sitting on the panel of just saying, what are you going to do it within your own agency and demonstrate that it can work? I like to send my folks to training. I don't have a huge training budget, but I do use my network of contacts that I have and swap people around, and even just have an hour-long coffee with someone to talk about what do you want to do, where you want to go. I think you should call Dr. Brown at DOD. I know they're recruiting for this position. Or give National Science Foundation a call. Robyn's looking for folks.
Please.
Yes. Well, stand in line, Robyn. I'm giving everyone here that wants to get free NCE people, come see me first. But no, we need to be afraid. We don't need to be afraid anymore to share talent, because what Dr. Brown said is absolutely correct. If you treat people well, they'll want to eventually come back to you in a different capacity, at a different level. The more we hold on to people and keep them into a position they've either outgrown, they were never well suited for to begin with, or it's just a complete mismatch, that's where we have catastrophe. And I agree with what Robyn said. I think we have the talent that we need. We just need to put them in the right places and support them. And it is something that you do continuously. Every administration thinks they've invented something new. Those of us that have been in the trenches, we know, we see this coming. They say, we want you to do this, this, and this, and we're cutting your budget by 10%, you're not allowed to backfill. I mean, we're all experts at dealing with that now.
So I'll see your budget cut and stimulate the economy. I'll talk for a moment about what NSF's imagination is. And so when I talked earlier about leveraging advanced technologies to bring to bear for this culture of continuous reskilling, my dream is that these advanced technologies help us to connect what we know about ourselves as individuals and what we know about jobs that we might not have considered or that might not exist yet. And help us then get on a path to leverage training to get there. So that all implies that, you know, we have money to take advantage of the training. And this is where I'll echo what Dr. Brown said about if we can change the way we look at what constitutes training. I think people learn in different ways. We need to acknowledge that. We need to lower the barriers for access to training and lower the cost of training by being more open about what we accept as training. And so what NSF is doing is we went out to explore how we might build a tool that can do this for our staff, because we really want to empower them and we believe in a culture of continuous learning. And then we realized that that was short-sighted because we only know what we know, right? We think we're pretty savvy technologists. We think we're pretty much at market or ahead of the game. And but we don't really know about all the nascent technologies that are out there that could help us do this thing. And so but we believe it can be done. And so NSF on challenge.gov posted a challenge called NSF Career Compass. It's a compass, not a path. And the idea is that there's data and there's tools and there are people with ideas out there. And if we can get all of those people thinking together and creating a prototype of a tool that could help this ecosystem exist, somebody's going to make money off of that. Right? And in the federal government or an agency like NSF, is not built to manage a shared service for a tool like this to the federal government, and we shouldn't have to, right? We should give it to the people who know how to do the work, who know the technologies, who can make money off of it and stimulate the economy, and bring it to bear so that then when our training budgets get cut, right, we have a tool that we can leverage that opens the door for all kinds of training that we can access. Right? And we pay for a service fee to the tool.
So what's the status of that right now?
The Career Compass Challenge launched on November 9th, which was my mom's birthday. I'll never forget it. And it's a two-stage challenge. Part 1 ends on December 31st, and it asks anybody age 14 years of older that's an American citizen to submit their concept paper about how they could tackle this challenge of wanting to build a culture of continuous reskilling, leveraging advanced technologies. And so you can read all of this on challenge.gov, NSF Career Compass Challenge. After Part 1, up to 5 winning concept papers will get a small prize, and we will post those concept papers on challenge.gov for Part 2 solver community to look at. The idea is that I'm a worker. I have ideas about how to solve this problem, but I'm not going to build the tool, right? So I'm going to let the people that have ideas tell me what they think in the first part, and in the second part, which will start March, April timeframe, we give a little bit of time for people to read the concepts and maybe form teams. We'll invite solvers to build a prototype. And at the end, if there's a functioning prototype and it passes the judging criteria in August, they'll get a small award. And then, as we know with prize competitions, there is no follow-on. They walk away with their tool, right? But what we hope to do is stimulate, one, the thinking around this, generate conversation so that it takes hold more broadly, because you're right, it's not easy. If it were easy, it would have been done already, but we all have to be involved if we're going to get it done. And two, we want to not just stimulate the conversation, but also stimulate a marketplace around the government's need. Usually what we do is we write acquisitions to meet a need that we've imagined and that we can define pretty clearly, and we get what we ask for, right? But what I want to do is I want to stimulate thinking around a problem statement I have, and I want the market to respond to me instead of me taking what the market has to offer.
And so I'd like to add to that what we're doing for, Robyn and I are on the President's Management Agenda CAP goal for reskilling. And so taking that another step, we are looking at not necessarily a career pathing tool and an automated process for individuals that take everything that you are, who you are, all the skills and competencies that you bring to bear, that you want to share with the career pathing tool, all of the occupational specialties, competencies that are out there, so that you now have a tool that you can use yourself to determine what's the next career move for me, what's the next path, what's going on in private industry, what's going on across the federal space. And so the goal is that we will do an innovation day sometime in January, February timeframe, bringing together all of these companies that have this kind of automation. We're calling it a reverse innovation day because we know what we think we know, but we want them to tell us what we don't know. How do we take this to the next level so that we have something that we can use across the federal space instead of every individual organization creating this kind of capability? We want to be able to use it as shared services across the federal space so that we can conserve those resources that we have, and everybody's drawing from the same space. If you're going to train an HR specialist,
Yes.
it doesn't matter if you're DOD, if you're NSF, or if you're Peace Corps, or any other federal agency. There are basic occupational competencies that you need, also in the federal space. And
Yeah.
so how do we give back to the employee the ability to do that for themselves by leveraging technology, maximizing the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning so that they are in control. They're in the control seat.
And I
So-
just want to say, too, it's important to recognize, as a small agency, we do need folks like DOD, DHS, to carve that path, because I will never, ever have a budget to make those investments, but I may have a budget to pay like a licensing fee to help. In addition, we can already have some really good examples of where this has worked. Defense Acquisition University is, to me, the shining star, right? They are up there and they allow people to take courses for free on those critical occupations in the CFO shop. There used to be HR University, which unfortunately shut down last year. And it was a space, though, where agencies could share core HR business practices and training, because what Dr. Brown said is absolutely right. You can train a good, competent HR staffing specialist, and they should be able to go into any federal agency and maybe just learn the different authorities that that agency uses, some minor tweaks, but if they have the foundations done correctly, they're going to be much more employable. But there has to be a commitment to sustain those tools and not just tear them down and rebuild every couple of years because someone thinks they have a better idea. This work is already being done. It just needs to be leveraged and continued.
We do have time for a couple of questions. If you have one, raise your hand and someone will come around with a microphone.
Be patient, they're coming.
Thank you. Hi, Jeff Fetterman with Qualtrics. I had a quick question. There's been a lot of discussion about reskilling in this session and a little bit about hiring, but I'm kind of curious how retention fits into your plans to maintain your workforce. Obviously, it's a lot more difficult to bring someone into government than to work with people who are there, and with so many people who are eligible to retire, kind of how that fits into the whole scheme.
I'll go, if you don't mind. I think that in my personal experience, I'm very interested in retaining my team, and so I let them go work for other people in my group that I'm still going to benefit from right now, and then someday wherever they want to be. But when we talk about retention, I think it's very important to engage the individual in their choice about what's next for them. And so to the extent that we can find a way to continuously communicate what's happening, what's coming, do you want to be a part of that change? When we talk about advanced technologies, for example, at the National Science Foundation, we have no shortage of forward-leaning people who want to implement robotic process automation and test bots. Well, I need those subject matter experts to build the bot. Right? So now I've just given them a new skill set and I've retained them and they have a new job for another couple of years. It's probably going to stimulate and excite them in ways that they were bored before. So might they stay on a little bit longer instead of retiring? Maybe, right? It's worth trying.
And so I echo that. I think that retention is key. I mean, it's much more difficult to bring in individuals than it is to take those individuals that you have on board and to reskill them and to retool them. But it all starts with, I don't care what anyone says, strategic workforce planning. So how do you know who you need to retain? How do you know what skills you need to retain until you know where those gaps are? And so I think DoD does a really good job with strategic workforce planning, forecasting that, and then also understanding what the retention rates are. So that's a specific question that we ask our DoD workforce on the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. You know, what are your intentions to stay within the Department of Defense, so that we have a mile marker or a milestone that we're using as we start to implement different programs related to reskilling or upskilling. In 3 or 4 years, we can see where that trend is going for those individuals who want to, who are thinking about leaving the Department of Defense. But our challenge in DoD is we have about 36,000 folks every year who move around DoD. So we retain them. They're just not necessarily staying in Army or Air Force or Navy or the Marines. They're moving around DoD. So that is absolutely key, and it's part of that strategic workforce planning that you must have.
Do we have other questions? I think so.
Hi, Brian Collins, National Commission on Service. I'm curious, with the reskilling efforts, how much of a barrier to that is the position classification system? And if that is a barrier, what might we do about it?
So I really think it's a myth. Everyone loves to blame HR, and it's a good thing I have very thick skin because I am an Eagles fan from Philadelphia. So I will boo Santa Claus. I'll boo all of you right back. Now, I think that classification standards, it's a myth that it is a barrier. If you read anything in Title V or you look at HR, there are tons of flexibilities. It's retraining people how to use them. So one example to speak to is, I think of the 343 series, which is Management Program Analyst. We have to get out of thinking you can only be a management program analyst for this department that hired you and trained you. It gets back to those core competencies we talked about. Critical thinking. Are you an agile thinker? Can you relate to other people? Do you know how to find information when you need it? I think what the classification standards do is, yes, there is some siloing in it, but we are training our HR specialists to use it in a more agile way, so it's opening doors up for other individuals. Now, having said that, though, you are not going to be spending 20 years of your life in the HR discipline and then become a CFO. You don't want me to be a CFO. You don't want me to be a CIO. I'm good at HR, but that's only because I've had other experiences before I landed in HR. So it is a misnomer, I think, to say the classification standards, and everyone wants to blow up Title V and say it's terrible. It exists for a reason, because we never want to get rid of the merit principles. That's the driving foundation of any federal occupation. But we need to train our HR staff to understand how to better interpret it, and also to understand to folks what it means when they're in a certain classification, what skill sets they should be developing to move them into another career or another track.
But I think we also need to train our managers and supervisors to know what competencies they want. Classification offers the parameters. It's going to give you a right and left limit. But within those parameters, what competencies do you want? And you have to ask for those, because when you submit those job announcements, it's up to you to sit down and think, I need these skill sets in addition to what's classified. And if you don't do your homework and determine what those are, you're going to get anybody based on those classification requirements. So managers and supervisors have to do their homework.
So I would like to wrap this up with a question for each of you. And what is your advice to everyone in this room and the federal workers out there to be prepared for this, their future workforce, whatever it may turn out to be?
I always like to leave everybody with homework. So I like to issue a challenge to the extent that we can each think about playing forward the work that we do 5, 10, 15 years from now and imagining what could be possible and not being afraid of that conversation. I think we all need to come to the table, have a place that we're looking forward to, and then plan for how to get there. Things, like I said earlier, are not going to move any more slowly. There will be a need to reskill and redeploy. My children will probably do it 100 times more than I will, right? And so how do we then, as a community, come together and make sure that all these things that we're espousing as virtues of cultures of continuous learning and lower the barriers of access to training and what constitutes qualified workforce, how do we make it possible that that workforce can get that job in the future? And I don't have that answer. If I did, we'd make it happen already. But I need all of you to think about that and engage with your communities and make it happen.
I think that we also need to understand that the nature of work will change in the future. We don't know what that nature will be. We do know that technology will play a key piece of that. So I think that we need to make sure that our workforce is not afraid that that technology is going to replace them. In some occupations, it may support them much greater than they are. But I think our managers and leaders and supervisors need to understand not to be afraid of that technology, to embrace that technology, to see how the whole systems fit together so that they can make the right decisions for the future workforce. So I think that that's key.
And I would just say everyone needs to take control and ownership of their own career, be agile and open to making moves that may be lateral in nature, but they're going to teach you something different and broaden your skill set. And if they can leave you with one thing, it is call me. I have tons of Peace Corps volunteers that want to work for you.
And that sounds like a great way to wrap this up. Please join me in thanking the panel.